Hello, I'm Pete Jennings and welcome to this presentation on medieval elves, which is brought to you in conjunction with the Children of Artemis, who present the Witch Fest events that I'm frequently a guest of. So, what do you think of elves? Do you believe in them? What's your picture in your mind of an elf? People have got all sorts of ideas, haven't they? For many people, their first experience of elves are in children's books, of course, or later on The Lord of the Rings book, all the films, fantasy role play games, films. Remember Will Ferrell in Elf? Victorian art, especially the lovely stuff by Arthur Rackham. Um, General mythology from around the world, graphic novels such as Elf Quest, and who can forget Dobby the House Elf in Harry Potter. Um, And of course, there are Germanic tales, especially those written down by the Brothers Grimm. In my life, the traditional folk songs and stories of England. But we also have pagan art, Icelandic sagas, and Anglo-Saxon texts. Dr. Alaric Hall of the University of Leeds, who we'll come across again later, um, wrote that the derivation of the words elf and alfra is the white one. And he also discusses the Old English word elfskin, elf beautiful, and the way that the word gender starts in Old English as a masculine word but turns to feminine. And if you want to check out his dissertation that he's done for his doctorate, you can see the title down there. And I'd also recommend the book by Stewart, The Anglo-Saxon Elf, which is available, which was created in Australia. So, in that classic Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, elves are included among the misbegotten creatures condemned by God and named alongside Germanic giants, Etins, and hell devils. There's a fragment of the lost tale of Wade, which begins, "Some send ills," and it's translated by Glance as "all creatures who fell become elves or adders or nicors who live in pools. Not one became a man except Hildebrand." Go forward a bit to Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Titania, the fairy queen, enters. "Come now, a roundel at a fairy song." Then for the third part of a minute hence, some to kill cankers in the musk-rose buds, some war with rear mice for their leathern wings to make my small elf coats, and some keep back the clamorous owl that nightly hoots and wonders at our quaint spirits. Sing me now asleep, then to your officers, and let me rest. We've also got the Sir Topas story in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from 1387, in which he describes the hero desiring the elf queen. And some of the later Scots beliefs are detailed in The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies by the Reverend Robert Kirk, who was the minister of Aberfil in 1691, which I can recommend. Which trials provide us with some information about elves. Isabel Gowdy of Ayr and Marion Grant described an elf as a fine woman clad in a white wally coat, and another one as Brawley, handsomely clothed in white linen with brown and white clothes. And there was Andrew Mann in 1598, who was Marion's friend, and he said that the Queen of Elfhame could be as old or as young as she liked, and that he had sex with her. She and her company rode white horses and had playing and dancing whenever they pleased. They had human shapes, yet were as shadows. And then Alison Pearson in 1588 told how the elves taught her to pick and use herbs in remedies, but sometimes disabled her for long periods by striking her. She also claimed to have been carried off to Elfhame several times. Staying in Scotland, brownies are invisible brown elves or household goblins who live in farmhouses and other country buildings within Scotland. While the members of the household are asleep, they go about doing labours for the house owners. Brownies are protective creatures and become attached to the families. If the family move, the brownie will move with them. In Scandinavia, they have a mischievous equivalent called the Nissa, and I don't think either of them are like Dobby from Harry Potter. So let's have a look at some elf Anglo-Saxon personal names. I have to make it clear first, elves are not fairies, they're not goblins, orcs or ents, although they've frequently been confused with them by some writers. Elfkin is an Anglo-Saxon term for elves in Old English, and it's possible they may have thought of them the same as wights, which is a spirit of the place. Many Anglo-Saxon names start with elf, or variants alf or alfra, such as Alfred, which was originally Elfred, name of one of the kings, and derives from elf wisdom. Elfwed derives from elf guard, and Elfwin derives from elf friend. So all pretty positive names, ones that you'd probably like to have. So although they sometimes credited the elves with being mischievous and so on, they also admired some of their qualities as well. While we're looking at Anglo-Saxon names, let's have a look at three place names that reflect an Anglo-Saxon belief in elves. There's Elfrug, which is Elf Ridge in Kent. There's Ilfingdean, Elf Valley, Elf Place Valley in Berkshire, and Elverdun, which is a village on the Suffolk side of the Suffolk-Norfolk border. The earliest 11th century references we have include Heluduna and Eludin, that both look rather like the Elfdenu or Elf Valley. And there was a girl in the 1800s who was passing a wood bordering the road when she heard something that made her stop. The sound was echoing out from between the trees, the sound of music, very high-pitched, chiming, tinkling and beguiling. And beneath that another sound of high-pitched laughter. And she was convinced that that was elves. And she continued to tell that tale way into her 80s before she died. If we go to more literary sources, there's a document called the Miraculous Saint Wittenberg, 12th century saint's life of Saint Wittenberg, and it records Elvedon in Latin, which translates as "from the lands of the king and martyr, the blessed Edmund," which is called Valley of the Nymphs in English, nymphs being another name for elves at that time. Of course, St Edmund was an East Anglian king, and the Domesday Book confirms that Elvedon belonged to the Abbey of St Edmund. So it all fits together, doesn't it? Right. So that's some of the Anglo-Saxon sources. What about some of the Norse ones? Well, with the old Norse sources, the Norse mythology divides Alfar into dark elves and light elves, created from the maggots breeding on creator Ymir's rotting flesh. And so the Svartalfa, the swarthy or dark elves, live in Svartalfheim, and the light elves, also known as Huldafolk in Iceland, live in Elfgard or Elfheim, and they're ruled by Freyr. Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century Icelandic prose edda implies that the dwarves are actually the dark elves, the Þokkælfa. So that gives some idea about the division. Okay, a little look at the rulers of the elves. We've got Volandra, the sacred smith, also known to us as Wayland Smith, is the Germanic ruler of elves under the protection of the Vanir fertility deity Freyr. And he's shown on a picture stone from Andre, pumping the bellows of his forge. And to the right is Freyr and his sacred boar. So the elves have always been associated with the Vanir race, which were the really older set of gods within the Old Norse mythology before the later Aesir came along. It's clear that some of the pagan Scandinavians did have rituals to celebrate and honour elves. These are normally known as Alfablut. And there is a record of a man called Sigvat Thordarson. Now, he was a Norwegian Christian missionary for St. Olaf. He wrote a poem in the autumn of 1018. It's called the Astrafabridisa, the Eastern Journey verses, describing his journey to the border areas. So while in Sweden, because he'd gone over the Norwegian border, being a Christian, he was refused board in some heathen households because an elf sacrifice, was being conducted there. Now, this is a very significant thing because giving hospitality to strangers, any stranger, is a very important thing normally within Scandinavian culture. So to actually refuse somebody, you've got to have a pretty good reason, and obviously they thought this was a pretty good reason. We go over to Iceland in the Icelandic Cormac saga. There's a lady called Thordis who's described as a spay wife, a sort of wise woman, cunning woman, and she advises a wounded man, Thorvald, to sacrifice an ox and then to sprinkle its blood and leave meat at an elven mound to aid his recovery because he's been wounded in a duel. Let's talk about changelings. Elves, along with fairies, are credited with taking human babies and leaving a changeling in its place. These changeling children usually eat a lot, grow monstrously quick, and are full of mischief. So humans would sometimes use iron to dissuade them, since the elves and fairies didn't like iron being around. Um, Elves, of course, may also carry off adults to Elfheim, their kingdom, where the person is kept for 7 years normally, after which they might be given as a soul gift to the devil, according to Christian sources. If they escape, they sometimes find that much longer has elapsed than the 7 years they thought. And, people they used to know have all died off and so on. And some of these stories are preserved in old folk ballads. So let's have a look at elves in traditional British folk ballads. In Childe Roland, the ballad, and all its variants, of which there are many, there's an elf knight, sometimes known as an outlandish knight. He bears away Isabel to murder her. Now, that's a very old ballad, but Robert Browning, the poet, wrote a poem about Childe Roland much more recently, and they shouldn't be confused together. There is another song called The Queen of Elfland's Nurse, and a woman is abducted to wet nurse the elf queen's baby, but it's promised that she may return home once the child is weaned. Another song called The Elf Knight. There's a woman who's abducted and has impossible tasks set to avoid becoming the elf's mistress if she can't carry them out. The earliest printed copy of that dates to about 1600, but it's probably much, much older. And then there's 700 Elves, which concerns an attack on a farm, and is actually a translation from the Danish ballad Elin of Viljenskov. I suppose many of you may have heard of the song Tam Lin, a very long ballad, which I'm only going to quote a short piece from here. It's in a Scots dialect, so I apologise in advance for any mispronunciations that I make, but just to give an idea of it. An ansid fell upon a day, a cold day and a snell, when we three the hunting come, the three my hoss I fell. The Queen of Fairies she caught me, in yon green hill do dwell. And pleasant is the fairyland, but an eerie tale to tell. Aye, at the end of 7 years we pay a ting to hell. I am so fair and full of fish, I'm feared to be myself. Almost as well known, probably through some of the versions from Steel Span and Fairport Convention and so on, is the song Thomas the Rhymer. And in this, the supernatural queen is initially mistaken for the Queen of Heaven, the Virgin Mary, by Thomas, but she identifies herself as the Queen of Elfland. And the Queen is able to show Thomas three paths, one leading to her homeland, Elfland, and the other two to heaven and hell. Now, there's a theory that the queen who Thomas Rhyme met at Ercheldoune in the song was the Saxon goddess Urkel, known as Wassel or Ursel, who became later Saint Ursula, according to a German origin explanation noted by the American Fisk. A bit of a change of subject now, elf shot. There was an Anglo-Saxon belief in some illnesses being caused by elf shot, which is mentioned in Bald's Leech book of the mid-10th century. But it was still being written about in 1691 by the Reverend Robert Kirk in the Secret Commonwealth. And of course, sometimes they found little flint arrowheads in the soil, which we now nowadays to be from an earlier time. And there's a little picture of a couple of them there. So there's a thing from 1750 by William Collins. You see, normally we're talking about, something like a sudden stitch, a stroke, or a heart attack in a human. But William Collins actually alludes to the fact that the complaint can be in cattle or whatever. He said, there every herd by sad experience knows how winged with fate their elf-shot arrows fly. With a sick ewe her summer food forgoes, or stretched on earth the heart-smit heifers lie. And I'll finish there with a thing from the Anglo-Saxon Edwin Salter. And surrounded by little characters and full of arrows. Is this a depiction of elf shot, or are they little devils or demons? We really don't know. Slightly less troubling than elf shot, but still annoying. Elf locks, and they're knots in the hair of a person or a horse's mane causing trouble in combing, and it was blamed on the elves. If you've ever had a young girl with long hair and trying to comb it out and hear all the squawking, you'll know it's still a problem. In fact, Shakespeare wrote Queen Mab of the fairies causes an elf lock in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which dates around 1592. So, if you're having problems with elves, you've got to do something about it. And so, we're going to look at some Anglo-Saxon healing charms. Some of them are a curious mix of both pagan and Christian methods. The first one there is against a dwarf or a fever, from the Harley manuscript 585 from the British Library, and it dates to around 1000 AD. So the names of the seven sleepers are written on communion wafers, and a charm sung onto the patient's left ear, their right ear, and the top of their head. And then a maiden has to hang it around the patient's neck and leave it for 3 days. So presumably these communion wafers are strung together on a bit of string. And you must have to have a friendly priest to supply those, I would imagine. If it's something like a sudden stitch, Harley manuscript 585, again from about 1000 AD, you need some feverfew, red nettle and plantain, boiled up in butter, and you recite a verse. It doesn't tell you which verse, mind you. A magic knife is used to extract the shot and return it to running water or a mountain. And then water elf disease, which is Royal Manuscripts 12, which is mid-10th century. Water elf disease, it's possibly chickenpox or measles, although nobody's absolutely sure. There's a large selection of herbs steeped in ale, holy water added, and a verse sung over the patient. And then reflecting the fact that this could happen to animals as well, if a horse be shot with illness, mid-10th century, using a ritual knife with a yellow horn of ox handle, 3 nails driven into it, scribe the cross onto the head of the horse, spine and limbs. Pierce the left ear in silence. I take it that that's the silence of the person doing the piercing, not the horse being having its ear, having a hole drilled in it. You then hit the horse on the back with a wand. Sounds very pagan. Right on the handle of the knife, blessed be the works of the Lord of Lords. If it is a question of elves, in this case, this may well help. So says the document. Okay, here's one more of those mixture of pagan and Christian methods. A salve against elves. To make a salve against the elf race and against night spirits, and against women who have slept with the devil, take the female hop plant, wormwood, bishopswort, lupin, verbena, henbane, harewort, viper's bugloss, heathberry, leek, garlic, cleaver seeds, cockle, and fennel. Put the herbs in a bowl, put them under an altar, and sing 9 masses over them. Boil them in butter and sheep's fat, add holy salt, strain it through a cloth, and throw the herbs into running water. If a man has evil temptation or is troubled by elves or night spirits, smear his face with this salve and on his eyes and anywhere else that hurts, and smoke him with incense and make the sign of the cross. His condition will soon improve. Well, nobody's going to do much temptation against him if his face is smeared with that lot, I wouldn't have thought. But there you go, a salve against elves. Of course, it's a continuing story, elves. It didn't just finish in Anglo-Saxon times. We continue to have artworks of elves. We continue to have some residual beliefs about elves and fairies. You know, the toadstool ring. There's not many people will happily jump into the middle of one of them. There's poetry, and nowadays lots of films and books and so on. And I'm sure it will continue to develop. A place where elven beliefs are still very current is Iceland, which I've had the pleasure of visiting. You can see the picture on the left is Alfaborg near Borgafjörður, which is believed to be a castle of the Hulda folk or elves, and a very special place. And then on the right is something you can see all over the place, elf houses. This one is at Stradakirkja in South Iceland. Sometimes it's just a little pile of rocks or a little mound, but sometimes doorways are added to alert others of the rock status and warn them not to disturb it. And in fact, the Icelandic Parliament employs 2 experts to warn where elf sites are, where the Hulda folk are, because they don't want to disturb them when they build new buildings or build a road. Because if people believe that the road cut through an elven site, they wouldn't want to use the road, or they wouldn't want to rent the building or buy the building that was in the way. So these experts will advise where they can divert round, or sometimes they'll carry out a little ceremony to ask the elves to just would you mind moving a little to the side so we can build a road through here? And I say there's two people actually employed to advise the authorities in Iceland, and it's thought of as quite a reasonable thing. Not everybody would admit to believing in elves, but on the other hand, they do want to go against them. You know, it's like people say they're not superstitious, but still don't walk underneath the ladder, do they? There's many people who feel a strong connection with the Landvertier and the Holder folk, the Land Whites and the Hidden People. Um, and Carolyn Emmerich wrote about Iceland's belief in elves and made the point that Icelandic elves communicate with humans in various ways. They can express dissatisfaction in ways that are non-verbal, but nevertheless blatantly communicative. For example, they may cause rock slides and other natural disasters to let it be known that human activity has angered them. They can also cause illness in humans, failure of crops, and disease in livestock. But when the elves are pleased, however, they may bless a farmer with an abundant harvest or grace their region with pleasant weather and smooth sailing seas. So some Icelanders believe that elves live within boulders and large rock formations. And if a boulder is known as an elf home, it's considered disrespectful to climb on it or disturb it in any way. Bad luck could befall someone who disturbs the elves. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed this presentation on medieval elves by myself, Pete Jennings. You can find out lots more about me and my activities and books and talks at my website, www.gibberswick.org. And all my books are available via the Veiled Market site. That's www.veiledmarket.com. And that includes the Elfame trilogy of novels, incorporating its research, East Anglian folklore, place name origins, history, and Anglo-Saxon elves. And it's an interesting thought of how it came to be written. Originally, I was going to write some very wonderful thing about um, Anglo-Saxons' attitude to elves, and it was going to be quite academic and so on. And anyway, just before I was about to set to work, I gathered all my research and so on together. I had a last minute check to see if anybody else had done anything about it lately. And up popped the doctorate of Dr. Alaric Hall, who'd written just about that. Well, I couldn't do something identical. It had been thought that I was copying him, plagiarism. Um, Although I had got folkloric stuff which was different to what he was doing in his doctorate. And so I decided to put all the information that I'd researched into this series of three books. Each one of them can be read individually, but in order. They are Adventures in Elfame, The Borders of Elfame, and it culminates in The Weird of Elfame. Um, and if you've enjoyed hearing about the elves, please go and buy Adventures of Elfame, and it will lead you on to the other ones. But my thanks to you for listening and watching. To the Children of Artemis for frequently putting me on stages to talk about this stuff. If you are a glutton for punishment, you can see some more of Pete Jennings' presentations on YouTube. I have got my own little channel, so you can see the address there, youtube.com stroke at Pete Jennings 4468. There's that many Pete Jenningses in the world. Anyway, the presentations include the Woodwoes, the Wild Hunt and its followers, Black Dogs of East Anglia and beyond, Blacksmith Gods, Myths, Magicians and Folklore, the Valkyries. So those are the ones that are on the channel. There are a few other ones of mine around in odd places. So if you search Pete Jennings, that should lead you to them. But thanks for watching. Bye.